If you want to open your Bibles, we're still in Ezekiel chapter 1. This is the third of our lessons in the series on the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a prophet to the Jews who were in exile in Babylon. He was in the first group that was deported in roughly what was it now? I remember I got the 698 and 598 mixed up last time. I'm not even going to try. But anyway, he was deported. A few years later, there would be another larger deportation. And much of his message concerned this subject. There were many back in Israel and even among the exiles who said that there would never be any more people deported, that the temple would never be destroyed, the city was secure and all that. And there were prophets that would back them up, and that's when this well-known scripture, they cry, peace, peace, when there is no peace. That's what he was speaking of. And what he was saying was to these people was, settle in. You know, the Lord has sent us here, and it's for a prescribed time, and the temple is going to be destroyed, and the city be destroyed, and just as God said it would. And so let's read the account of his first vision. It says, beginning in verse 4, I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was that of a man, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf, and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had the hands of a man. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and their wings touched one another. Each one went straight ahead. They did not turn as they moved. Their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a man, and on the right side each had the face of a lion, and on the left the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out upward. Each had 2 wings, one touching the wing of another creature on either side, and 2 wings covering its body. Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go without turning as they went. The appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire or like torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of light, or flashes of lightning. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature, with its 4 faces. This was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like chrysolite, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. As they moved, they would go in any one of the 4 directions the creatures faced. The wheels did not turn about as the creatures went. Their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around. When the living creature moved, the wheels beside them moved. And when the living creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, and the wheels would rise along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When the creatures moved, they also moved. When the creatures stood still, they also stood still. And when the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels rose along with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Spread out above the heads of the living creatures was what looked like an expanse, sparkling like ice and awesome. Under the expanse, their wings were stretched out one toward the other, and each had 2 wings covering its body. When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. When they stood still, they lowered their wings. Then there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads as they stood with lowered wings. Above the expanse over their heads was what looked like a throne of sapphire, and high above on the throne was a figure like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and that from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking. Now, last week we excuse me, made a few general statements about this vision. The most important one probably being this: the vision is not the message. The vision was the preparation for the message. And the reason we need to distinguish this is that people try to make too much out of the vision as though there are hidden messages in it, and there aren't. There was a message in the vision, that is, it was meant to communicate something, but it was not what Ezekiel was to communicate to the Israelites. It wasn't the message that God was going to give to Ezekiel to pass on to the rest of the Jews. Rather, it was primarily a message for Ezekiel to impress him with who it is that's speaking. We noted that the vision, as it's described, you have these four creatures, which in chapter 10 we find are representations of the cherubim. We have over top of them an expanse, is how they define it. It's the same word used when it says that God created the firmament between the waters below the earth and the waters above. And then you have above that firmament, expanse, vault, dome, you have this throne and a glorious person sitting on that throne and encircled with a rainbow. So there are several things to note. There's fire and lightning, living creatures, intersecting wheels, an expanse of firmament, a throne with someone sitting on it, and a rainbow. Now, all these together are designed to show us who it is that's speaking. That's the primary thing. And what it was is a cosmological picture. God, while he was not promoting the concept of flat earth and all that, he spoke to people in the language they spoke, and that's how they talked. They believed that there was the earth, above it was spread out this vault or dome or expanse, and then above that was the heaven of the heavens, God. So he comes to them, or comes to Ezekiel, representing the universe as it is spiritually, but not as it is physically. Because it is true, God is above and beyond us. Now, not as though, God's not a physical being. He doesn't exist in time and space like we do. He's outside of our reality. Now, I know he enters it, but that's a different matter altogether. God, in his absolute person, is spirit and invisible and all these things. But if he's going to speak to us, he has to speak to us in terms we understand. So he is represented as God, and primarily, I believe the most important representation of him as God is that he is above it all. And that's an important aspect. This is the voice of one or the message of one who's unaffected by what goes on down here. It doesn't change him. It doesn't move him. And it represents him as a king. Now, this, when we talk about him being king, we're talking about him being sovereign. We've got to remember, he represents himself as a king on a throne in this symbol. And you got to, what was their idea of a king back then? Here it is, the Queen of England is 95 or something like that now. She can't be queen much longer. Eventually, Prince Charles is going to be king, but it won't mean anything. He can sit on a throne, and they'll probably have a lot of pomp and circumstance and a coronation and all that kind of stuff, and then everybody will go on about their day. Because that king doesn't have any authority or power. But you got to think about these kings. The kings of this day, so much as they could pull it off, they were absolute dictators. Their word, there were plenty of people rushing to fulfill it and impose it upon everybody. That's the kind of king God is representing himself to be. He's on a throne. The scriptures say a glorious high throne is the place of our sanctuary. That word sanctuary actually means the holy place. And the holy place, particularly the most holy place in the Jewish temple, was where the Ark of the Covenant was with the cherubim over top of it. And it's written that the Lord is enthroned between the cherubim. So that Ark of the Covenant was considered to be his throne. And that is our sanctuary. That is our holy place. That's where we meet God. We do not worship a God who is anywhere but on a throne. He says, Isaiah saw him and described him as high and lifted up and seated on a throne. The Psalms say, heaven is thy throne, or heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool. That's God's description. Now, the sovereignty of God, the absolute, complete, undeniable sovereignty of God is never questioned in the Scriptures. In fact, it is so much taken as a given, the Scriptures do not defend the doctrine very often. It's kind of like this isn't something you should have to defend. I believe it's our declaration starts with these words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Okay? They didn't spend any time arguing these points. Why? They're self-evident. The Scriptures don't argue things that don't need to be argued. For instance, the doctrine of election. I only know of one place that it's actually argued. That is, that it's given defense, and that's in Romans chapter 9. Everywhere else, it's just stated. This is self-evident. It's obvious. If God's God, this is what he's got to be like. But every time God is represented in visions, it's in association with thrones. It's in association with authority. He is sovereign in authority, power, will, and conduct. Now, I speak of his sovereignty in these four areas, for there are many who would grant him sovereignty in some of these areas, but not in all of them. He's sovereign in authority. Now, most Christians will acknowledge this. At least they'll confess it. By their conduct, they generally prove they don't believe it. But it means, they think, being sovereign in authority means nothing more than God is a legitimate and rightful lawmaker, and he has the right to decide how he wants things to happen. Well, that sounds real good. The problem is, authority and power aren't the same thing. And authority and power is not the same thing as will and conduct. Power and authority are different in this. Authority means you have the right to do something. Power means you actually have the power to do it too. There are those that have authority but no power. Every political office in the world, it doesn't matter what is, how much power someone claims. They only have as much power as they have. They may have given to them great authority, but they either don't have the political abilities or whatever to actually enforce their laws. They don't have the power to carry out their law. You have the other way around too. You have people that have power, but they don't have the authority. For example, again, our Constitution was written to give very limited authority to the federal government. And anybody that can read English and then see what our government does realizes they far exceed their authority in what they do. And the reason they do it is simply because they can get away with it. They have the power to do it. A thief has no authority to take your money, but he's got the power to do it. He may hold a gun to your head. You know, that didn't give him authority, but it'll sure get you to hand over your money. See? Well, God has both. He has authority to decree whatever he wants to. And no one even has the right to question him. Now that's authority. You know, you don't even say, why'd you do it that way? Another place in the scripture says he gives no account of his deeds. He doesn't. And when someone in Romans 9, Paul brings up a question he knew somebody would eventually ask, and that is, well, why does he yet find fault if no one's resisting his will? You know, if everyone's just doing what God decreed, how can he find fault with us? And Paul didn't try to make some fancy legal argument. He said, who are you to reply against God? You know, it's just not allowed. Why? He has that much authority, and he's got power to back it up. But there are a couple more characteristics. And these other two things, sovereignty of will and sovereignty of conduct, they're really declarations that not only does he have the authority, he exercises it. And not only does he have the power, he extends that power. There are some who believe that God has the right to decree all things, but has chosen to leave some matters to the will of man, particularly matters of man's salvation. I mean, that's an argument. Oh, he sovereignly chose to not be sovereign. But you can't do that. You can't do that. He actually has decreed all that will come to pass. Every iota of history, the history of this universe, is a product of his will and decree. Everything he decrees happens, and nothing happens unless he decreed it. I remember Don Fortner mentioning this in a fashion that even some sovereign grace people might have difficulty, but he's dead right. He said, whatever happens, God did it. He is the original cause of all of it. People say, oh, you're making God the author of sin. Not in the sense that, and I think that comes from the Westminster Confession, in trying to describe God's sovereignty. But said, you know, said blah, 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 not such that he is the author of sin. And they're talking about, I believe what they mean by that is he does not enter the heart of man and prompt him to sin. But every sin ever committed, God decreed it. And if anyone has a problem with that, I'll take them to Peter's words. When he was accusing the Jews on the day of Pentecost, he says that with wicked hands they had crucified Christ. They did what God foreordained they would do. God decreed the most wicked thing that man ever did. He decreed the fall of Adam. He decreed the wickedness of Satan, all of it. Now, he's not responsible for their wickedness because he decreed it. You say, why? Well, who are you to reply against God? That's the answer. He decrees it, and yet we know this. It's not like we're going around saying, I really want to be good, but God decreed that I'm going to be bad. You know? No. I really want to be saved, but God didn't choose me, you know, so I can't be saved. No. Every man of his own free choice. And I don't mind using the word if we mean free within the context of this creation. We're all doing exactly what we want to do. God's sovereignty, when I go down the buffet line, God has already determined what I'm going to put on my plate. It's not like I'm going for the green beans and suddenly my hand just accidentally goes over the corn instead. No. And yet, once I have exercised my free choice, as that's what it feels like to me, once I've done what I wanted to do, if I could see God's decree, you'd find that that's exactly what he wrote before he ever brought the world into existence. Actually, this is a philosophical necessity. And, well, it's simply impossible that God could decree something and it not happen. Or that something could happen that God didn't decree. We know this if we understand the relationship between God and his creation. The views that people have of God are simply far too small because they perceive him as a being within the bounds of our creation. And he's not. He is the self-existing one, uncreated, outside the bounds of time and space. And the only reason that our reality exists is because God thinks it does. That's it, And you've heard me use it. It's just like an author and his story. The only reason that the play Romeo and Juliet exists is because Shakespeare wrote it. And everything Shakespeare wrote happens in that story. And nothing happens in that story unless Shakespeare wrote it. And, someone might complain, well, I'm not just a character in a play. No, and God's not just a human author either. But as a human author relates to the characters he creates in his story, so does God relate to us. He's not just a big version of us. So, we are God's story. For lack of a better way to put it, we are God's fiction. From the viewpoint of God, what we call reality, he calls fiction. Now, understand fiction doesn't mean a lie. Fiction is simply a different kind or different level of reality. People say, well, Romeo isn't real. Yes, he is. He's a real character. Shakespeare is a real author. And we're real creatures. God's a real creator. But that's different kinds of reality. Now, what this means is, what I'm talking about here is the sovereignty of his will. He not only has the right to determine what will happen, he actually does. A person might not exercise all the rights they have. God does. And then sovereignty of conduct. Not only does God have the right and power to make things happen according to his will, he actually makes things happen according to his will. Now that's the exertion of his power. Paul described it this way in Ephesians chapter 1, I believe it's verse 11. He works all things according to the counsel of his own will. Now, decreeing a thing's one thing. Making it happen's another. Sometimes I've described this as a difference between his transcendent sovereignty and his imminent sovereignty. And those are big words, but they don't have small words to describe what I'm talking about. Transcendent God, that's God outside the universe. And he's absolutely sovereign from there because whatever he wills, that defines our reality. And yet we also see that he enters our realities and works all things according to the counsel of his own will. Well, what's his will? What does he mean by that? It doesn't just mean that he works everything according to the decree. It means that God has a will, a purpose for this creation. And the ultimate purpose of this creation is his own glory. And that's going to be accomplished through the glorification of Jesus Christ in the salvation of his people. And what it's saying is that God works everything, actively causes everything that happens in this universe, causes it to happen to bring about that purpose. Just like when you go on a trip, your will is to arrive at your destination. That's your purpose. That's your stated goal. And you work everything to the best of your power to bring that to pass. Well, that's what Paul means when he says he works all things according to the counsel of his own will. Will this accomplish my will or will it not? Well, if it won't, it ain't going to happen. If it is, it's going to happen. So God is more sovereign than even some sovereign grace people think of it. Or they don't bother to go into this much detail about it. But he's sovereign that he has all authority, and he's sovereign that he exercises that authority. He's sovereign that he has all power, and he's sovereign that he exercises all that power. Nebuchadnezzar put it this way: he does as he wills among the armies of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand. That's power. Or say unto him, what are you doing? That's authority. And God has all of it. All right. Now, let's consider these living creatures. Now, these living creatures are identified as cherubim in chapter 10. Now, cherubim only appear 3 or 4 times in the scriptures. That is, that you actually, instances. I mean, the word is used more often than that. But there were cherubim at the gate of Eden. There were likenesses of cherubim put on the Ark of the Covenant. They were on the, woven into the curtain that separated the holy place from the most holy place. And I think they were woven into some of the fabric that made up just the outside walls of the tabernacle. And when Solomon built the temple, there's cherubim everywhere. Okay, there were cherubim then again in the temple. There's the cherubim mentioned here in Ezekiel. Now, what are these creatures? Well, one thing we need to, depending on which translation you use, we don't have any words for simply a living thing that don't carry connotations with them. People talk about the beast from Revelation. We say beast, we're thinking of some, generally speaking, a brutish, ignorant, powerful, and dangerous thing. It just meant a living thing, Same way with the word creature. Remember the cheap horror flicks, the creature from the swamp, and that kind of stuff. You hardly ever use the word creature in a good sense. And we don't really have a generic word for simply to describe a living thing. But that's all that's meant. That, he's not trying to say that there's anything special about them when he uses the word creature. Now, there were 4 of them. And, excuse me, trying to get back to where they are described here in the scriptures. Okay. They were underneath the expanse. Now, one of the things that tells me, I believe, that this is speaking of God's activity in the world. Now, above the expanse, that's God in his holy high throne, beyond our existence and all that. Now, these cherubim, which were symbols of the guardians of places, guardians of the throne, yet what we learn is they're always doing what God wants them to do. That's, you never hear of cherubim in terms of disobedience. And so they are, I don't know if they represent anything actually real, in the same sense, like we're real or whatever, or if they're just symbolic beings meant to indicate God's active participation in world events, either directly or through agents. In the book of Revelation, it talks about the elders and 4 living creatures and all of this. And there are some who believe that these four living creatures represent preachers. But whatever these cherubim indicate, they are extensions of the authority of God, the authority and power of God. And it says that, let's see, they had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight. Now, and their feet were like those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze. There was hands under the wings, and their wings touched one another. Now, here's the thing. We don't know where it says their wings touched one another. Actually, it says their wings spread upward and touched one another. And we don't know whether it meant if they spread their wings out and each was touching the wings of another cherubim, or it meant that they were up like this, and the tips of their wings touched each other. Now, I tend to think that these 4 creatures, that their wings were spread upward and out, and yet they were touching one another's wings, because I believe the cherubim in the temple were made that way. It says specifically, each one covered half the distance across the holy place, most holy place, and that the wings touched in the middle. So I think that probably that's what it means. And what you have here, if that's true, then they were arranged in a square, because that's the only way you could get all wings touching some other wing from another creature. And that makes sense, because one of the things that's being taught in these 4 creatures with 4 faces is that God's power extends in every direction. Now that's, most of the nations had their own gods, and they thought their gods ruled in their territory. But the God of the Israelites is God of everywhere. And, he does what he, not only does what he pleases, he goes where he pleases. And when you consider now that Ezekiel is a Jewish prophet in the land of Babylon, and God comes to him to speak to him. Ezekiel's separated from the temple with all the exiles with him. They don't have access to the temple. And part of this message is, don't think I'm not here. And don't think I can't go wherever you go. I am God over all. And so these 4 creatures, these 4 beings, each of them with 4 wings stretched out, touching one another, and I'm assuming they made this square. And they had 4 faces. It's kind of obvious this is a symbolic representation. And we're not even sure that there's any spiritual being behind it. I don't know. It doesn't matter. Because the symbols are there simply to teach us something. First of all, the front face was the face of a man, which is generally used to describe reason, wisdom, in these symbols. And then on the right side, there was the face of a lion, boldness, authority. Lions were associated with thrones. And in fact, many of the cherub, it's not as though Israel was the only one that had these. Other of the cultures had their versions of it, and many of them were lion-like. But who who doesn't back away from a lion? And then it says that on the left face, an ox. And then it said each also had the face of an eagle. So that's got to be pointing backward. Well, an ox speaks of strength and power. So you've got wisdom, and you've got royalty and authority, strength and all that, and then power. And then this face of an eagle, perception. Eagles are raptors. They see from way up on high. It is really remarkable. I read about how far up they can be and see a mouse on the ground. And you and I wouldn't have a clue there was a mouse there. You put all these together. What is it telling us? It is speaking of all these characteristics of God extended into our universe. His wisdom, reason, and all that in the face of a man. His power and awesome authority like a lion. His awesome strength and, like an oxen. And his perception of all things way up here. Now, these things he gives to his agents because he gives them his word. So once again, whether these cherubim represent just God extending himself into the world, or the agents, the preachers and prophets and apostles, but it doesn't matter. The effect is the same. Here is divine wisdom, power, strength, all these things represented by these animals. And it's active in our world. Now it says next to these creatures, it says they have, their legs were straight, which was opposed to a four-footed beast, and a lot of times you can't see, what an animal's leg is really shaped like because they crouch. And quite often the knee is already up into the body and you don't even notice it, But you look at a dog's leg, it's not straight. And I can't remember how old I was when I realized that he doesn't have two knees and one of them's just backwards. That what looks like a backwards knee that's their heel. And they're always on their toes. That's the way most four-footed beasts are. Well, this is saying that it has the legs of a man, straight legs. But it has feet like a calf. Now, I can't tell you, at least I can't discern any particular meaning in all of that. But they are always described in terms of gleaming, brilliant, power under their wings. On the four sides, they had the hands of a man. And hands are always given for activity. And so it's just indicating they not only can fly around, birds can fly, but they can't grasp anything. Well, these creatures have the advantages of wings and arms to do things. Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go without turning as they went. Now, this would kind of lead you to think in terms of the agents of God within the world. But again, here's the Spirit of God in them, leading them. So once again, it's just the extension of God's power and authority in this world. Now, it says there was a wheel beside them, and beside each one of them, a wheel intersecting a wheel. And the best we can do is try to guess what these things looked like. Some have put two concentric wheels, one inside the other. John Calvin was saying that, or his commentary implied that what it means is these four wheels were connected. But it seems to me that that each wheel was independent of the others in terms of any obvious connection, but that each of them was made of two rings running perpendicular to one another. And the reason was so they could roll north or south or east or west. Anyway, another example of God's going everywhere in the world, and they could do so without these cherubim changing at all. They didn't turn. They're going this way and then it goes that way. That's all it was. And of course, then you had the expanse, was just simply, separating earth from heaven. Now, it does speak that when the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings like the roar of rushing waters. Think Niagara. The sound of thundering waters, like the voice of the Almighty. like the tumult of an army. Now what you have here is two natural pictures of enormous power. Rushing waters, thundering sound. The voice of the Lord shakes the earth. And then the tumult of an army. An army with its great power, the larger your army, the more power. And what it's saying is here that the voice of the Almighty, powerful, like the roar of rushing, I think technically the word is many waters. It's like the tumult of an army. Can you imagine what it's like if you're in a city and here comes an army and they've been given the charge and you just hear this massive sound coming towards you? And that's the way it is with God as he exerts his divine power and authority in this world. You can't stop Niagara Falls. You can't stop an army. And you cannot stop the voice of the Almighty. When he speaks, things happen. Well, we've already gone over the description of the one on the throne. And it says, but let's mention this rainbow. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell face down and heard the voice of one speaking. Now, we all know what a rainbow means in the scriptures. The rainbow of Noah's day, and once again, you go to the book of Revelation, and it describes God on his throne, and it says an emerald rainbow. God's always bringing us back to his covenant of promise. And his covenant of promise encircles the throne, directing it. Don Fortner wrote a song, and one of the lines was, God's special love for all his own directs the power of his throne. And that's what's being shown here. And here's the thing. The likeness of the glory of Jehovah. Here is the glory of our God. His covenant and his sovereign power to bring it to pass. And all of this is on display for Ezekiel. All these various symbols before God ever says a word. He says, I am God. I am on the throne. I'm God everywhere. I am God unstoppable. I am God, the God who made covenant with you. What I say will happen. Judgment will happen. But my covenant will not fail. I will spare all whom I have reserved. There's always been a remnant according to the election of grace. And they are in that covenant of peace. And you can say to them, to these righteous ones, it will be well with them. All right, I wanted to spend more time than we got to spend on the creatures last week and those other things. Next week, we'll pick up and with where God begins to speak.